London just sent 50 men to their graves, and they did it with a smile. They thought they were building an underground army in the heart of the occupied Netherlands, but in reality, they were hand-delivering their elite agents to a German reception committee. This was Operation North Pole, a psychological massacre where the British provided the guests of honor and the German Abwehr provided the handcuffs. For 20 months, London didn't just lose a secret war. They unknowingly funded and equipped the very enemy they were trying to destroy. The nightmare began in a cold, damp basement in 1942. A radio operator's fingers are trembling, not from the chill, but from the crushing weight of the words he is forced to transmit. Every letter he taps out is a death sentence. He is sending the secret code that tells his superiors back in England that everything is fine, the resistance is growing, and they need more men, more money, and more supplies. But standing directly behind him, a German officer, some Sun officer, is calmly smoking a cigarette, watching the rhythmic dance of the telegraph key with a satisfied smile. This was the opening move in the Englandspiel, the great game. A chess match where the board was an entire country and the pieces were human lives who had been captured before their feet even touched the soil. By 1942, the Special Operations Executive in London was desperate to set Europe ablaze. They wanted to drop agents into the Nazi machine to sabotage railways and organize a shadow army. The plan was bold, the stakes were absolute, and the volunteers were the bravest men the Allies had to offer. They were trained in the dark arts of silent removal, high explosives, and complex encryption. But there was a fundamental flaw in the design of their shadow war, a crack in the armor that German military intelligence was ready to exploit. They didn't need to break the British codes. They just needed to take over the hand that sent them. The trap was sprung with the capture of a single man, Hubertus Lauwers. He was a radio operator dropped into the Dutch countryside with a mission to establish a lifeline between the resistance and London. He didn't even have a chance to unpack his gear before the Abwehr was at his door. In that moment of capture, the trajectory of the war shifted. Major Hermann Giskes, the mastermind of the German operation, saw an opportunity far greater than a simple arrest. He didn't want to silence Lauwers. He wanted Lauwers to keep talking. He turned the radio into a siren song designed to lure more British agents into the abyss. In the world of espionage, every agent has a security check, a deliberate mistake or a hidden signal in their transmissions to prove they aren't working under duress. Lauwers was a professional who understood his duty. When the Germans forced him to transmit, he intentionally omitted his security checks. It was a silent scream for help vibrating across the airwaves. He expected London to see the missing signal, realize he had been compromised, and immediately cut the line. He waited for the silence that would signal the end of the operation. But the silence never came. Instead, London replied with a congratulatory message and a schedule for the next drop. The tragedy of Operation North Pole is not just that the Germans were clever, but that the British were inexplicably blind. For the next 20 months, a surreal and horrific game unfolded. Every few weeks, a British plane would fly low over the Dutch forests. Under the cover of a moonless night, the agents inside would look down and see the signals from the ground. The correct lights, the correct patterns, indicating a friendly reception. They would jump into the blackness, feeling the rush of wind and the sudden jerk of the parachute, believing they were landing in the arms of the resistance. But as they touched the soil, they weren't met with a whispered password and a warm meal. They were met with the cold muzzles of rifles and the polite, terrifying greeting of German officers. The efficiency of the trap was breathtaking. The Germans would capture the agents, seize their equipment, and then use the newly captured radios to double the volume of the deception. London was delighted. On paper, the Dutch resistance was becoming a powerhouse. They were sending tons of high-grade explosives, thousands of Sten guns, and millions of Dutch guilders directly into the hands of the German army.
Cheers.
The British intelligence officers, sitting in their comfortable offices, were patting themselves on the back for their success, while, across the sea, their agents were being ushered into interrogation rooms and high-security prisons. The psychological toll on the captured agents was a different kind of darkness. Imagine the isolation of being an elite operative, trained to believe you are the tip of the spear, only to realize that you are nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. These men were forced to watch as their own country sent more of their friends into the same trap. They tried to send warnings through their letters home, using subtle hints and coded language, but these too were often intercepted or ignored by a bureaucracy that refused to admit it had been fooled. The silence from London wasn't just a failure of intelligence. To those on the ground, it felt like a betrayal. As the months dragged on, the Germans grew more brazen. They weren't just catching agents, they were mocking the entire British establishment. Major Giskes was running a shadow resistance that existed only in his reports to London. He would report successful sabotage missions that never happened, or claim that a bridge had been destroyed when it was actually being used to transport German troops. To keep the illusion alive, he would stage fake events or hide genuine British equipment in secret caches that he then allowed his own men to discover. It was a masterpiece of theater where the audience was the enemy and the actors were paying the ultimate price for their roles. Questions remain that the history books struggle to answer. How could the British ignore the missing security checks of over 50 different radio operators? Some suggest it was mere incompetence, a failure of communication between the departments that trained the agents and the departments that received the messages. Others whisper of a darker possibility that the British knew. There are theories that the agents were sacrificed to keep the Germans focused on the Netherlands, diverting attention away from the real invasion plans in Normandy. If true, it means dozens of souls were treated as collateral damage in a grand strategic feint, left to rot in the dark, while their superiors checked their watches and waited for the real war to begin. The end of the game came not with a bang, but with a taunt. On April 1st, 1944, Major Giskes decided the play had run its course. He sent one final message to London, unencrypted and direct. He thanked the British for their continued cooperation and for the excellent equipment they had provided over the past 2 years. He even offered to act as a guide for any future visitors London might want to send. It was a humiliating blow, a professional slap in the face that exposed the absolute failure of the British intelligence network in the Netherlands. But the real horror wasn't the embarrassment of the generals. It was the fate of the agents. Of the 54 men who were dropped into the trap, only a handful survived the war. Most were moved from camp to camp as the Allied lines drew closer, until they were finally silenced in the final months of the conflict. They died in a void, their names forgotten for years, their sacrifices obscured by the sheer scale of the deception that led them to their graves. They weren't lost in the heat of battle. They were harvested like crops by an enemy who knew exactly when and where they would arrive. The legacy of Operation North Pole remains a chilling reminder of the fragility of truth in a world of shadows. It highlights the terrifying reality that in the game of intelligence, your greatest enemy might not be the one across the battlefield, but the one sitting at the desk next to yours, who refuses to see the truth. The agents who fell into the Dutch forests weren't just victims of German cunning. They were victims of a system that valued the narrative of success over the lives of the people who were supposed to achieve it. Even today, looking back at the transcripts and the cold reports, there is a sense of a lingering mystery. Was there a mole in London feeding information to the Abwehr, or was it truly just a cascading series of human errors? The records are fragmented, and many were destroyed in the chaos of the war's end. What remains is a ghost story of the airwaves, a reminder that when you call out into the dark, you have to be very careful about who answers. The silence of the night in 1942 wasn't empty. It was filled with the static of 1,000 lies, and the men who fell through the clouds into the waiting arms of their captors are still waiting for a justification that may never come. The story of the Englandspiel is a dark mirror held up to the romanticized image of the spy. It wasn't about glamour or high-tech gadgets. It was about the crushing weight of isolation and the slow realization that you are utterly alone. It was about the sound of a telegraph key tapping out a message that you know is a lie, and the sound of a parachute opening over a field that you know is a trap. It is a cautionary tale that in the theater of war, the most dangerous place to be is on a stage where the director is your enemy and the script has already been written. As the sun set over the Dutch landscape in the spring of 1944, the radios finally went silent. The game was over, the pieces were cleared from the board, and the forest returned to its quiet state. But the echoes of those missing security checks still haunt the history of intelligence. They serve as a grim testament to the fact that in the world of high-stakes deception, the truth isn't just the first casualty. It's often the one that stays buried the longest, hidden under layers of pride and the cold earth of a foreign land. The agents dropped into the Netherlands were told they were the light in the darkness, the ones who would lead the way to liberation. They were young, highly trained, and possessed a courage that few can fathom. When they stepped out of those planes, they believed they were joining a brotherhood. The reality that they were being monitored by German intelligence from the moment they boarded their planes in England is a level of psychological horror that defies easy explanation. They were walking into a meticulously managed environment where every person they met, every safe house they entered, and every word they heard was part of a German script. Major Giskes played his hand with a terrifying level of patience. He didn't just capture agents, he managed their lives. He knew their aliases, their families, and their fears. He created a simulated reality so convincing that even the agents who were suspicious eventually succumbed to the logic of the situation. This wasn't just a military operation, it was an exercise in total control. By the time the British realized the depth of the failure, the damage was irreversible. The weapons they had sent were being used to fortify the Atlantic Wall, and the intelligence they thought they were gathering was being fed to them by the very people they were trying to outmaneuver. The Englandspiel remains one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern history, a case study in how confirmation bias can lead to catastrophe. London wanted the Dutch resistance to be successful so badly that they ignored every red flag, every missing code, and every warning sign. They chose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth, and in doing so, they signed the death warrants of their own men. The ghosts of Operation North Pole still linger in the archives, a reminder that in the world of secrets, the most dangerous weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but the belief that you are smarter than the person you are trying to fool. When we look back at the history of World War II, we often focus on the grand battles and the clear victories. But the story of the Dutch radio games reminds us that there was another war, one fought in basements and over airwaves, where the lines between friend and foe were blurred, and where the cost of a mistake was measured in lives lost in total silence. The agents who fell into Giskes' trap deserve to be remembered not as failures, but as men who were abandoned by the system they served. Their story is a dark chapter in a dark time, a reminder that the shadows of war are often deeper and more treacherous than we care to admit.